A humble cleaning lady starts working in a mansion where an elderly woman lives in isolation and neglect. After hearing a subtle cry for help, she discreetly begins a care routine that brings joy back to the woman's life. But this bond triggers the anger of the controlling daughter-in-law, who tries to put an end to it. Only when the patriarch witnesses this genuine affection does he realize the emotional abandonment he imposed on his mother and the true value of being seen. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Teresa Oliver was already on her feet that Tuesday morning. At 42, her face, marked by time and a hard life, contrasted with the sweet and serene gaze she maintained even in adversity. She put on her blue uniform, already faded from so much use, packed her simple lunchbox in a floral cloth her late mother had embroidered years ago, and checked once more if she had set aside her son's medication. "Paul, my love, Mommy is off to work now. Mrs. Nora will be here soon to stay with you, okay?" Paul, a 19-year-old with autism, rocked gently in his favorite chair as he methodically arranged his miniature cars in a perfect line. He did not respond verbally, but his eyes lifted for an instant, recognizing his mother's voice. For Teresa, that brief look was worth more than 1,000 words. The clock marked 6:15 a.m. when she left the small terraced house in the Brixton neighborhood, South London. She took 2 crowded buses and a tube train until she disembarked in Kensington, one of the most affluent districts in the London capital. The contrast between the two worlds always struck her, even after so many years working in the mansions of the London elite. Stepping off on Oxford Street, she walked a few more blocks until she reached an imposing neoclassical mansion, hidden behind high walls and an ornate iron gate. She rang the intercom punctually at 7:30 a.m. "Good morning. I'm Teresa, the new staff member." The gate opened with an electronic whir, and she walked through the impeccably maintained garden, admiring the sculptures and sophisticated landscaping that adorned the path to the main entrance. The Montgomery Alden family home was one of the most traditional in London high society. Its owners were proprietors of one of the largest construction companies in the country, with projects spread throughout the United Kingdom. She was received at the service door by Yvonne, the mansion's housekeeper for over 20 years. "You must be Teresa." "Punctual, I like that," commented the housekeeper, a tall black woman with an assertive posture and severe expression. "I'm Yvonne, responsible for all the staff in the house. Come, I'll show you your duties and the house rules." As they walked through the rooms on the ground floor, Teresa absorbed every detail of that world so distant from her own. The paintings by renowned artists, the imported furniture, the decorative objects that probably cost more than she earned in an entire year. "The house has 3 floors. You will be responsible for cleaning the ground and first floors. The second floor is private, and only those with express authorization from Mrs. Regina or Dr. Edward may go up there." "And who lives on the second floor?" Teresa asked out of curiosity. Yvonne stopped walking and stared at the new employee with narrowed eyes. "Mrs. Cecilia, the family matriarch. She is not in good health. She has her own nurses and caregivers. It's not your area, understood?" Teresa nodded in silence, noting the sharpness in the housekeeper's voice when mentioning the elderly woman. Something in that tone stirred her intuition. Years of caring for her autistic son had given her a sixth sense for perceiving when something wasn't right, especially when it came to vulnerable people. "Is Dr. Edward the owner of the house?" she asked, trying to understand the family dynamics. "Dr. Edward is the only son of Mrs. Cecilia and the late Dr. Augustus. He runs the family businesses and is rarely home. His wife, Mrs. Regina, manages everything here." Yvonne lowered her voice. "A piece of advice. Do your job in silence and don't get involved in family matters." The last cleaner didn't last even a month. The morning passed quickly as Teresa familiarized herself with the mansion's routine. Cleaning, polishing, organizing. The work was exhausting, but she was used to it. Every drop of sweat meant Paul's sustenance, his medication, his therapies. Around noon, Teresa was cleaning one of the corridors on the first floor when she heard a muffled sound coming from the upper floor. It sounded like a call, a fragile voice asking for help. She looked around to make sure she was alone and remained still for a few seconds, listening intently. The sound repeated itself. "Help, someone, please." Driven by the same compassion that guided her in raising her son, Teresa discreetly climbed the stairs, leading to the second floor. The corridor was silent and dimly lit, with only 3 closed doors. She approached the one that seemed to be the source of the calls and knocked softly. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" There was no answer. Teresa slowly pushed the door ajar and saw a large room decorated with antique and elegant furniture, but with a melancholic air of abandonment. By the closed window, in a green velvet armchair, sat an elderly woman with white hair and a thin face, with blue eyes that seemed to have lost their sparkle. "Are you all right, ma'am?" "I heard someone calling for help." The elderly woman turned slowly, as if the simple movement required great effort. Her eyes met Teresa's, and for an instant they seemed to come alive. "The window one, please. I'm suffocating in here." Teresa approached and opened the heavy damask curtains, revealing a stunning view of the mansion's gardens. She unlocked the window and allowed the fresh morning breeze to enter, bringing the scent of flowers. "Are you Mrs. Cecilia?" "I'm Teresa. I started working in cleaning today." The elderly woman nodded slowly, her eyes now fixed on the garden below. "They lock everything. They say it's to protect me from the cold, the pollution." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "But what makes me sick is this isolation, this prison." Teresa felt her heart clench. She knew that look well. It was the same one she saw in Paul's eyes when he felt misunderstood, when the world became too overwhelming. "Would you like me to leave the window open for a while?" "Yes, please," and the elderly woman hesitated, as if afraid to ask too much. "Could you bring me some water? My bottle has been empty since last night." Teresa checked the thermos bottle on the small table beside her, and indeed it was completely dry. "Of course. I'll be back in a minute." She quickly went downstairs, filled the bottle with fresh water in the kitchen, and returned to Mrs. Cecilia's room, taking care not to be seen by Yvonne or any other staff member. Upon returning, she found the elderly woman still contemplating the garden, as if observing a distant and inaccessible world. "Here's your water." "Mrs. Cecilia." The elderly woman drank eagerly, as if quenching an old thirst. "Thank you, my dear. You're new here, aren't you?" Her blue eyes examined Teresa with more lucidity than one might expect. "Be careful. My daughter-in-law doesn't like the staff talking to me." "Why?" Mrs. Cecilia sighed deeply, a sigh laden with untold stories. "She says I have cognitive problems, that I confuse things, that I make up stories." Her eyes welled up. "Perhaps I really am losing my memory at times, but I'm not incapacitated as she makes everyone believe." The sound of heels in the corridor interrupted the conversation. Teresa quickly moved away from the window. "I must go. I'll come back another day to see how you are if you allow me." "Please come back." Mrs. Cecilia's voice suddenly sounded alert, almost desperate. "It's been so long since I had a real conversation." Teresa quickly left the room, closing the door behind her, and descended the stairs in time to resume her work in the corridor before Regina, Mrs. Cecilia's daughter-in-law, could find her on the forbidden floor. As she scrubbed the marble floor, her thoughts remained with the lonely elderly woman. That casual encounter had awakened something in Teresa, the certainty that, behind the facade of wealth and prestige, lay a story of emotional abandonment that she, somehow, was destined to uncover. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching from. Continuing. In the days that followed, Teresa found small windows in the mansion's strict routine to visit Mrs. Cecilia. She brought flowers discreetly picked from the garden, biscuits saved from her own lunch, and, most importantly, her company, something that seemed to be worth more than any material gift to the lonely elderly woman. One Wednesday afternoon, while most of the staff were busy with preparations for a business dinner that evening, Teresa went up to the second floor carrying an old book she had found in the ground floor library, Iracema by José de Aloncar. "Mrs. Cecilia, I brought something I thought you might like," she said, entering the room after a gentle knock on the door. The elderly woman, who was sitting in her usual armchair by the window, which now remained open thanks to Teresa's regular visits, turned with a smile that lit up her wrinkled face. "Teresa, my dear, I thought you weren't coming today." "I managed to finish my tasks early." Teresa approached and showed her the book. "I found it in the library. The cover was dusty, as if no one had opened it in years. I thought perhaps—" Mrs. Cecilia's eyes shone with emotion as she recognized the work. "Iracema! My favorite book in my youth." Her trembling hands caressed the cover, as if reuniting with an old friend. Augustus gave me this copy when we were engaged. It was a first edition. I thought it had been lost in the last renovation of the house. Teresa sat on the edge of the bed, observing the transformation in the lady's countenance. It was as if years of sadness momentarily dissolved, revealing the young woman she once had been. "Would you like me to read a little?" "Oh, yes. My eyes are not what they used to be." Mrs. Cecilia settled deeper into the armchair, getting comfortable to listen. "Start with Chapter 2, where Erasima meets Martim for the first time. It was always my favorite passage." Teresa carefully leafed through the book, found the mentioned passage, and began to read in a slow, expressive voice. Erasima, the virgin with honey lips, whose hair was blacker than the wing of a grauna bird. As she read, she glanced at Mrs. Cecilia, closing her eyes, letting herself be carried away by the words. A solitary tear trickled down her wrinkled face. "Are you all right, Mrs. Cecilia?" "Better than I've been in a long time, my dear." The elderly woman wiped the tear with the handkerchief she always kept in her dressing gown pocket. "You know, I was a professor of Brazilian literature before I married Augustus. I taught at the University of London. I gave up my career when we married. It was what was expected of women of my generation." "Do you regret it?" Mrs. Cecilia reflected for a few moments. "Not marrying Augustus. He was a good man, despite his absences, but I regret completely giving up my identity." Her eyes gazed at the horizon through the open window. "When my husband left this world, I realized I no longer knew who I was beyond the wife of or the mother of." Teresa felt a deep connection with those words. Since Paul's diagnosis, her entire life had been redefined by special motherhood. Sometimes she also wondered what had become of the Teresa who dreamed of being a nurse, who liked to dance, follow on Saturday nights, who had plans beyond surviving day after day. "I understand that feeling," she confessed. "Sometimes I think my life is just being Paul's mother, my son. He has autism, you know. And since the diagnosis, everything changed. My ex-husband couldn't handle the pressure and left when Paul was only 5. "And you raised your son alone?" Mrs. Cecilia's eyes showed genuine interest. "Yes, it wasn't easy, but I found strengths I didn't even know I had." Teresa smiled thoughtfully. "Paul taught me to see the world differently, to value small achievements, to have patience, to communicate without words." Mrs. Cecilia extended her hand and held Teresa's with surprising firmness. "You are an extraordinary woman, Teresa. I see in your eyes the same strength I saw in the great literary heroines I studied." Her voice gained a confident tone. "Do you know why I like Erasima so much? Because she represents the feminine strength that sacrifices, but never loses her essence." "You haven't lost your essence either, Mrs. Cecilia. It's just dormant." The conversation was interrupted by footsteps in the corridor. Teresa quickly hid the book under the armchair cushion and stood up, pretending to adjust the curtains. The door opened without warning, and Regina, Mrs. Cecilia's daughter-in-law, entered the room. Tall, thin, with perfectly dyed blonde hair and designer clothes, she represented everything that London society considered elegant and sophisticated. "What's going on here?" she asked in a cutting voice, looking from Teresa to her mother-in-law. "The window was stuck, and I asked for help," Mrs. Cecilia replied with a tranquility that surprised Teresa. Regina walked around the room, examining every detail with suspicious eyes. "Shouldn't you be cleaning the main hall for tonight's dinner?" she addressed Teresa coldly. "I've already finished my tasks on the ground floor, ma'am. The housekeeper asked me to check if everything was in order in the rooms." "In the first floor rooms, I presume. This floor is not part of your duties." Regina approached the window and closed it with a sharp movement. "Today it's too cold for open windows, Mother. You know your bronchi are sensitive." Mrs. Cecilia did not respond, but her face returned to the apathetic expression Teresa had known on the first day. It was as if a curtain had fallen, concealing the vibrant woman who had emerged moments before. "You may leave," Regina ordered Teresa, "and do not return to this floor without express authorization. The next time will be grounds for dismissal." Teresa nodded in silence and left the room, not without exchanging a quick, complicit glance with Mrs. Cecilia. That look contained a silent promise. She would return. As she descended the stairs, she found Yvonne in the corridor with a worried expression. "Were you in Mrs. Cecilia's room?" the housekeeper asked in a low voice. "Yes. She asked for help with the window." Teresa repeated the same excuse. Yvonne looked around, making sure they were alone, and whispered, "Be careful, girl. Mrs. Regina controls everything in this house, especially access to her mother-in-law. I've seen 5 caregivers dismissed in less than a year." "Why? What happened to them?" The housekeeper hesitated, as if weighing the value of her words. "Let's just say Mrs. Cecilia isn't as incapacitated as they make her seem, and the more lucid she appears, the more threatened Mrs. Regina feels." "Threatened? By an elderly lady?" Yvonne gave a sad smile. "This house and everything it represents doesn't belong to Mrs. Regina, you know. Dr. Augustus left everything in his wife's name with lifelong usufruct. Only after—" Yvonne interrupted herself, realizing she had said too much. "Forget what I said. Just do your job and don't get involved." But it was too late. Teresa was already involved. The connection she felt with Mrs. Cecilia went beyond simple compassion. She saw in the emotionally abandoned elderly woman the same lost look she had so often identified in her son Paul. The look of someone who has so much to say, but cannot find anyone willing to truly listen. That night, returning home to Brixton after an exhausting day, Teresa found Paul meticulously organizing his collection of toy cars. Nora, the neighbor who cared for him while Teresa worked, reported that the day had been peaceful. "He ate, well, took his medication on time, and even watched that documentary about trains he likes so much," the lady reported. After Nora left, Teresa sat beside her son on the rug in the small living room. "Paul, today I met an elderly lady who reminds me of you." The boy continued aligning the cars without responding verbally, but Teresa knew he was listening. She also has many things to say, but the people around her don't have the patience to understand. I think I'm going to help her, just like the therapists helped you find your voice. Paul stopped for a moment and looked at his mother. He didn't smile, but his eyes fixed on hers for longer than usual, his particular way of showing connection. "I know you understand, my son. You taught me that everyone deserves to be truly seen, beyond appearances." As she prepared a simple dinner in the small kitchen, Teresa mentally planned her next visits to Mrs. Cecilia. She would bring more books, perhaps some current magazines, anything that could reconnect the elderly woman with the world beyond those opulent but cold walls. What Teresa didn't know yet was that Regina had already begun her own investigation into the new cleaner, and that the real challenge was just beginning. Saturday morning dawned grey in London, with a fine, persistent drizzle blurring the city's outlines. It was Teresa's day off, but her thoughts remained at the Montgomery Alden mansion, specifically on the 2nd floor, where Mrs. Cecilia was probably watching the rain through the window that now remained ajar. A small act of rebellion the two had conspired. "Mum, we're out of sugar," Paul's voice sounded from the kitchen, where he was preparing his breakfast, strictly following the routine he had established for Saturdays. Teresa smiled. In recent months, her son had shown significant progress in verbal communication, a result of the intensive therapies she managed to maintain with great sacrifice. "There's more in the pantry, son, on the top shelf." As she listened to Paul's precise movements in the kitchen, Teresa reflected on the past week. After the confrontation with Regina, she had to be more cautious in her visits to Mrs. Cecilia. They developed a system of communication with notes hidden under the flower pot that Teresa changed twice a week. She had also discovered a rarely used service staircase that led to the 2nd floor without passing through the main corridors. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was an unknown number. "Hello? Mrs. Teresa Oliver?" The male voice on the other end sounded formal, but not threatening. "Yes, who is this?" "This is Edward Montgomery Alden. I am Mrs. Cecilia's son." The mention of the name made Teresa sit upright in bed, suddenly alert. "I apologize for disturbing you on the weekend, but I would like to speak with you in person. Is that possible?" Teresa's heart raced. Had Regina Told her husband about her visits to the elderly woman? Of course, sir. Has something happened? I prefer to discuss it in person. Could you come to my company on Monday at 2 p.m.? I will send a driver to pick you up at the mansion after your lunch break. The formality of the invitation did not allow Teresa to refuse. I will be available, yes. Excellent, until Monday then. The call ended, leaving Teresa with an uneasy feeling. What did Edward Montgomery Alden, who barely appeared at the mansion, want with a simple cleaner? The weekend passed. More slowly than Teresa would have liked, burdened by the apprehension of Monday's meeting. Not even the park outing with Paul on Sunday managed to fully distract her. Her son, sensitive to changes in her emotional state, asked in his own way, "Mom, sad?" "No, my love, just worried, but everything will be all right." On Monday, Teresa arrived at the mansion at the usual time and performed her tasks, trying to maintain normality. At noon, she found a note from Mrs. Cecilia hidden under the violet pot. "I miss you. The reading reminded me of so many dreams I abandoned. Thank you for bringing me back." The words warmed her heart but also increased her concern. If she were dismissed after the meeting with Edward, how would Mrs. Cecilia react to yet another abandonment? At precisely 2 p.m., a man in an impeccable suit and military bearing presented himself in the kitchen where Teresa was finishing her lunch. "Mrs. Oliver? The car is waiting." Yvonne, who was supervising the kitchen, cast an intrigued glance at Teresa, who merely shrugged, pretending not to understand what was happening. The journey to the business center in Canary Wharf was made in silence. Teresa watched the city through the window of the luxury car, feeling out of place in her simple uniform. The driver took her to the 25th floor of a mirrored building and handed her over to the executive secretary, an efficient-looking woman with an evaluating gaze. "This way, please." She was led to a minimalist meeting room with a panoramic view of London. The city, seen from that height, seemed unreal, like a giant anthill where tiny people went about their lives oblivious to the superior gaze watching them. Teresa felt a pang of resentment, thinking about how much power was concentrated in those glass towers, while so many struggled for crumbs in the peripheral neighborhoods. "Mrs. Oliver, thank you for coming." The deep voice came from the door that had just opened. Edward Montgomery Alden was a man in his 50s, with grey hair at his temples and penetrating brown eyes that resembled Mrs. Cecilia's. He wore a tailored suit that certainly cost more than Teresa earned in 6 months. "Mr. Edward." Teresa stood up, uncertain how to greet him. He extended his hand for a firm handshake and indicated for her to sit down again. "Would you like some coffee?" "Water." "No, thank you." Edward sat opposite her, placed a tablet on the table, and looked her directly in the eyes. "I'll get straight to the point, Mrs. Oliver. It has come to my attention that you have been visiting my mother regularly, despite my wife's express instructions that staff not interact with her beyond what is strictly necessary." Teresa felt her stomach drop, but held his gaze firmly. "Yes, sir." "That's true. Why?" The direct question caught her by surprise. She expected accusations, not questions. "Because your mother needs human companionship, sir. Someone to see her as a person, not as a burden or a responsibility." Teresa paused, deciding how far she could go. With all due respect, she is being treated as if she no longer exists. Edward showed no reaction to the harsh words. He continued to observe her with a neutral expression. "What exactly do you do during these visits?" "We talk." I read to her. "Sometimes we simply sit in silence looking at the garden." Teresa smiled slightly. "Mrs. Cecilia has a brilliant mind, you know. She told me about her career as a professor at the University of London, about the books she wrote, about the trip she took with your father." A shadow of surprise crossed Edward's face. "She spoke about my father?" "Yes, with great affection. She said he was a severe man in business but gentle at home. That he respected her intelligence, even in an era when few women had access to higher education." Edward leaned back in his chair, seemingly processing the information. "My mother has episodes of mental confusion. Doctors diagnosed the onset of a degenerative condition." His tone was clinical, distant. "Regina insists she needs a controlled environment, without stimuli that might disturb her. With all due respect, sir, what disturbs your mother is the isolation, the lack of purpose. Teresa leaned forward, momentarily forgetting the social difference between them. My son has autism, so I understand better than many what it means to be treated as incapable, when in fact you just perceive the world differently. Edward raised his eyebrows, surprised again. You have a son with autism? Yes, Paul, 19 years old. Teresa's face softened when speaking of her son. He is brilliant in his own way. Many would see him only by his limitations, but I see his unique intelligence, his sensitivity, his special way of loving. And you believe my mother is being misunderstood? I believe she's being made invisible, Mr. Edward. There is a difference between caring and controlling. Teresa took a deep breath. When I read Irasema to her, Mrs. Cecilia recited entire passages from memory. She spoke about literary theories with the lucidity of an academic. Yes, she has occasional lapses, moments of confusion, but that doesn't justify treating her as if she were no longer among us. A heavy silence settled in the room. Edward stood up and walked to the window, observing the city below. For a few minutes he stood there, his back to Teresa, seemingly absorbed in thought. When he finally turned, his expression had changed. Mrs. Oliver, how old are you? The unexpected question disconcerted Teresa. 42. When my father passed away, I was your age. Edward sat down again. I plunged into work to avoid grieving. I left the family details for Regina to manage. It was convenient. Teresa remained silent, realizing that this powerful man was, perhaps for the first time in years, confronting his own choices. Are you familiar with the concept of anticipatory grief? He asked. Not exactly. It's when we start to emotionally distance ourselves from someone who is still alive, anticipating their departure. Edward was speaking more to himself now than to Teresa. When the doctors mentioned the possible diagnosis, I think all of us started treating my mother as if we had already lost her. An unexpected tear gleamed in the corner of Edward's eye, surprising both him and Teresa. He quickly wiped it away, as if not allowing himself such a display of vulnerability. What do you suggest, then? He asked, resuming his professional tone. Teresa felt the weight of responsibility. Her answer could change Mrs. Cecilia's destiny. I suggest you visit your mother without prior notice, that you talk to her without Regina or the caregivers present, that you listen to her truly. Teresa paused, and then decide if she is truly incapable of making decisions about her own life, or if she just needed someone to believe in her capacity. Edward observed Teresa for a long time, as if evaluating not just her words but her character. Finally, he nodded. I appreciate your honesty, Mrs. Oliver. May I ask you one last thing? Of course. Continue visiting my mother. Continue reading to her, but keep our conversation confidential for now. His eyes met Teresa's with intensity. I want to observe the situation myself before making any decisions. And what about your wife? She made it clear she doesn't want me near Mrs. Cecilia. Edward smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Leave Regina to me. From today you report directly to me regarding my mother. He extended a business card. My personal number. Any problems, call me directly. Teresa accepted the card, feeling she had just crossed an invisible line. She was no longer just a cleaner. She had become, without planning, a kind of bridge between a mother and son separated by years of emotional distance. Thank you for your trust. Mr. Edward. Edward, just Edward. He stood up, indicating the meeting was over. The driver will take you back. And Mrs. Oliver, Teresa, thank you for seeing my mother when all of us stopped looking. On the way back to the mansion, Teresa felt both relieved and apprehensive. She had gained a powerful ally but also made an enemy in Regina. And something told her that Mrs. Cecilia's daughter-in-law would not easily accept losing the control she had established over the house and its inhabitants. But for now, Teresa allowed herself a small smile of victory. That afternoon, she would take the second volume of Irasema to Mrs. Cecilia and would once again see the sparkle in her blue eyes when José de Alencar's words brought back memories of a full and purposeful life. Oxford Street was engulfed by a relentless storm that Wednesday. The London sky, normally grey with pollution, now poured down furious rain that turned the streets into small rivers and sent pedestrians scrambling for shelter. Regina Montgomery Alden watched the rain from the spacious study she kept on the first floor of the mansion. Dale space she had converted into her personal operations center. There, she managed not only the house, but also the family's social life and the various charitable institutions she presided over, commitments that conferred prestige and power in London high society. Her gaze, however, was not fixed on the storm, but on an open folder on the mahogany desk. Inside it, the report commissioned from a private investigator about Teresa Oliver. So that's it, she murmured to herself, studying the document with a calculating expression. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Regina, it's Edward." "Hello, darling." Her tone instantly changed to a studied sweetness. "Will you be able to come home today? The storm is terrible. Actually, I'm calling to inform you that I'll be staying in the city for the next few days. I have important meetings and don't want to risk the commute in this weather." Regina narrowed her eyes, sensing there was something more behind that decision. "I understand. And what about Saturday's dinner with the investors?" "You know I confirmed with everyone. Keep it as planned. I'll be there." A pause. "How is my mother?" The question, seemingly casual, made Regina's body tense. Edward rarely asked about his mother-in-law. As always, Dr. Marcia visited her yesterday for her monthly evaluation. There have been no significant changes. "Right, I need to go. We'll talk later." Regina put the phone back on the hook with more force than necessary. Edward's sudden concern for his mother, after so long of indifference, couldn't be a coincidence. Not after that meddlesome cleaner started working at the mansion. She reread the report one last time and made her decision. She picked up the phone again and dialed a number. "Dr. Marcia? Regina Montgomery Alden. We need to talk about Mrs. Cecilia. Today, if possible." Meanwhile, upstairs, Teresa was helping Mrs. Cecilia prepare for lunch. The elderly woman, who had rarely left her room before, now insisted on coming downstairs for occasional meals in the small winter garden, a change Teresa had suggested, and Edward had supported during his surprise visit the previous week. "Is this dress all right?" "Teresa?" Mrs. Cecilia asked, smoothing the floral fabric of the simple but elegant dress she had chosen. "It's perfect." "Mrs. Cecilia, you look lovely." The elderly woman smiled, a smile that now appeared frequently on her once melancholic face. "You know, when you first came here, I barely looked in the mirror." "What for?" "No one really saw me." She pinned a small emerald brooch to the collar of her dress. "This was a gift from Augustus when Edward was born. He said it matched my eyes." Teresa helped her with the pearl necklace that completed the ensemble, noting how Mrs. Cecilia's posture had changed. She now walked more upright, spoke with more firmness, her eyes had regained their sparkle. It wasn't just the physical appearance, it was as if her very essence was resurfacing. "Are you ready to go downstairs?" Edward promised to call in the mid-afternoon. Mrs. Cecilia nodded, her face lighting up at the mention of her son. "I never thought we'd have real conversations again. Since Augustus's death, he distanced himself so much." A shadow of sadness crossed her face, so I think seeing me frail scared him. It reminded him of his own mortality. Sometimes people distance themselves out of fear, not lack of love, Teresa reflected, helping the elderly woman to stand. They descended together to the winter garden, a glass-enclosed space on the ground floor that offered a view of the main garden, now lashed by the rain. Yvonne had already set the lunch table there, with a hot vegetable soup and fresh bread. "Thank you." "Yvonne," Mrs. Cecilia said with a smile. The housekeeper, initially reluctant to the new dynamics of the house, now seemed more relaxed in Teresa's presence. She had witnessed the transformation in the elderly woman, and although she would never admit it openly, approved of the new cleaner's influence. "Enjoy your lunch." "Mrs. Cecilia, just call if you need anything." As the elderly woman began her meal, Teresa organized the books and magazines they had brought from the room for their post-lunch reading session. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a message from Edward. "How is she today?" Teresa smiled and quickly typed, "Very well." She chose a special outfit for lunch in the winter garden. "She's excited for your call this afternoon." The reply came almost instantly. "Great, I'll be there before dinner. I have a surprise." Before she could respond, Teresa heard the sound of heels in the corridor. Regina entered the winter garden with a severe expression, followed by a middle-aged woman in a white coat with a clipboard, Dr. Marcia, Mrs. Cecilia's private doctor, mother. "The doctor came for an extra evaluation," Regina announced with false sweetness. Mrs. Cecilia frowned, putting down her soup spoon. But she was just here 2 days ago. Regina. Yes, but I reported some concerns, and she agreed to check. Regina turned to Teresa coldly. You may leave. This is a family matter. Teresa hesitated, feeling the rising tension in the air. She looked at Mrs. Cecilia, who nodded discreetly, indicating she would be fine. Reluctantly, Teresa left the winter garden but remained in the adjacent corridor, from where she could hear the conversation without being seen. Mrs. Cecilia, how do you feel today? The doctor asked in a professional tone. Very well, doctor. Better than I've felt in months, actually. Have you had episodes of confusion, difficulty remembering names or events? Occasionally I forget details, but nothing significant. I'm reading again, you know? British literature. It helps keep my mind active. Regina interrupted. Doctor, she has been exhibiting concerning behaviors. Sudden mood swings, fixation on a specific employee. Ideas that she is being monitored. Mrs. Cecilia straightened in her chair, a spark of indignation in her eyes. That's not true, Regina. I am perfectly lucid. See? Regina turned to the doctor. Irritability, denial. Exactly the symptoms I mentioned. Teresa clenched her fists, outraged by the blatant manipulation she was witnessing. In her pocket, her phone vibrated again. It was Edward. I'm on my way. Has anything changed? Without thinking twice, Teresa replied, Regina brought the doctor for an extra evaluation. She seems to be trying to convince her that your mother is worse, not better. The response was immediate. Do not interfere. I'll be there in 30 minutes. In the winter garden, the evaluation continued. The doctor asked increasingly specific questions, clearly aimed at exposing possible cognitive failures. Mrs. Cecilia, however, answered with clarity and precision, frustrating Regina's efforts. Doctor, may I speak with you privately? Regina finally asked. The two women went out into the corridor, passing Teresa without noticing her, and entered the adjacent library. Teresa silently approached the ajar door. Dr. Marcia, we've been working together for years. You know how much I worry about my mother-in-law's well-being. Regina's voice sounded persuasive. Yes, Regina, but I cannot ignore the clear improvement in her cognitive state. She is articulate, oriented in time and space. Temporary improvements are common in degenerative conditions. You yourself explained this to me. Regina lowered her voice. What worries me is this fixation on the cleaner. An unqualified woman is influencing medical decisions. Do you understand the risk? I understand your concern, but... Doctor, the foundation I preside over has just approved a significant donation to the hospital's new research center. Regina's tone subtly changed. It would be regrettable if administrative issues delayed this process. Teresa held her breath, recognizing the veiled threat in Regina's words. The doctor remained silent for a few moments. What exactly are you suggesting, Regina? Just a re-evaluation of the therapeutic plan. Perhaps an adjustment in medication, something to keep her more stable, and a formal recommendation to limit interactions with unauthorized persons. Teresa moved away from the door, her heart racing. Regina was effectively trying to sedate Mrs. Cecilia and isolate her again. She checked her watch. There were still at least 15 minutes until Edward's arrival. She took a deep breath and made a decision. She returned to the winter garden, where Mrs. Cecilia remained seated with a worried expression. Mrs. Cecilia, I need to tell you something important. In a few words, she explained what she had heard and Edward's imminent arrival. The elderly woman's eyes, previously apprehensive, hardened with determination. So Regina wants to sedate me again. It wasn't a question, but a bitter realization. I've spent the last 2 years in a fog induced by medications I don't need. Edward is coming. He will sort this out. Mrs. Cecilia slowly shook her head. No, Teresa, I will sort this out. I have allowed them to take control of my life for too long. At that moment, Regina and the doctor returned to the winter garden. Regina carried a triumphant smile that faded when she saw Teresa beside her mother-in-law. I thought I asked you to leave, she said coldly. And I asked her to stay, Mrs. Cecilia replied, her voice surprisingly firm. As my witness, Regina raised an eyebrow. Witness? To what exactly? That I am in full possession of my mental faculties and refuse any alteration to my medication without my son's presence. Dr. Marcia looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Cecilia, we are only considering minor adjustments for your well-being. To silence me, you mean? Mrs. Cecilia stood up, leaning slightly on the table. Doctor, have you seen my will? The question caught everyone by surprise. Regina visibly paled. Mother, this is not the time for this kind of conversation. It's the perfect time. Mrs. Cecilia turned to the doctor. Doctor, are you aware that in the event I am declared mentally incapacitated, the administration of all my assets automatically passes to my son Edward and not to my daughter-in-law? A heavy silence fell over the room. The doctor looked from Mrs. Cecilia to Regina, beginning to understand the broader picture. And are you aware, the elderly woman continued, gaining strength with each word, that I have the right to change my will at any time, as long as I maintain my cognitive abilities? The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted the tense confrontation. Edward entered the winter garden, still in his business suit, with a grave expression. What's going on here? Regina quickly recovered. Edward! What a wonderful surprise. Her tone instantly changed to immediate sweetness. Dr. Marcia came to do a routine evaluation of your mother. Edward slowly looked at each person in the room, finally stopping at his mother, who remained standing with renewed dignity. Doctor, he addressed the physician, I appreciate your visit, but I would like a moment alone with my family. Of course, the doctor hastily collected her clipboard. We'll talk again later. As soon as the doctor left, Edward closed the winter garden door and turned to Regina. I want an explanation. Now. The silence that followed Edward's question was as dense as the storm that continued to lash London outside. In the winter garden, Regina remained upright, with the impeccable posture of someone trained never to show weakness, even when cornered. Edward, darling, you're misunderstanding the situation. Her voice was controlled, almost melodious. I'm just looking out for your mother's health, as I always have. Mrs. Cecilia, still standing by the lunch table, let out a dry, humorless laugh that surprised everyone. Looking out? Is that what you call keeping me drugged and isolated for 2 years? Edward looked from his mother to his wife, his face an indecipherable mask. Teresa remained discreetly beside Mrs. Cecilia, offering silent support. Teresa, could you excuse us? Edward finally asked. No. Mrs. Cecilia's voice sounded surprisingly firm. Teresa stays. She is the only person in this house who truly cares about my well-being, not my money or social appearances. Regina pursed her lips, a thinly disguised expression of contempt forming on her perfect face. Now it's clear what happened, she turned to Edward. This employee manipulated your mother, Edward. She created an emotional dependency, fueled paranoia. She probably has ulterior motives. Teresa remained silent, determined not to fall for the provocation. Edward, meanwhile, walked to one of the armchairs and sat down, indicating for the others to do the same. It was the businessman taking control of the situation, as he would in a difficult business meeting. Let's all calm down and talk civilly. His tone was controlled, but there was an underlying tension that did not go unnoticed. Mother, please explain what you meant by being drugged. Mrs. Cecilia sat with the elegance of someone who, decades ago, had presided over dinners for diplomats and businessmen in the same mansion. Her eyes, now clear and lucid, fixed on her son. After your father passed, I fell into depression, as you know, she began. Regina suggested I consult Dr. Marcia, who prescribed antidepressants. Initially, they were helpful, but over time the dosage increased. Anxiolytic sedatives were added. By medical recommendation, obviously, Regina interrupted. Medical recommendation influenced by you, Mrs. Cecilia retorted. Soon I could barely hold a coherent conversation. I lived in a state of permanent confusion. Exactly as you reported to the doctors I was. A self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Edward frowned, turning to his wife. Regina? Your mother was suffering, Edward. She needed professional help. Regina maintained her composure, but her fingers drummed nervously on the arm of the armchair. The doctors recommended medication to stabilize her. It was the consensus of the medical team. A medical team that reports to the president of the Montgomery Alden Foundation, Mrs. Cecilia observed, which coincidentally is you, Regina. A heavy silence followed. Edward seemed to process the information, his eyes moving from one woman to the other. Finally, he addressed Teresa. "And you? What's your version of events?" Teresa felt the weight of all eyes on her. She took a deep breath before responding. "When I started working here, I found an isolated, confused lady with no interest in life." She spoke calmly, choosing her words carefully. "It took only a few weeks of conversations, of reading, of simple human companionship, for Mrs. Cecilia to begin regaining her lucidity, her personality." "See?" Regina interrupted. "She admits to having interfered with an established medical treatment." "I didn't interfere with any treatment," Teresa defended herself. "I merely offered what no one else was offering. Respect for Mrs. Cecilia's individuality, recognition that she is still a complete person, not just a patient or a burden." Edward raised his hand, asking for silence. He walked to the window and observed the rain for a few moments, as if seeking answers in the storm. When he turned, his face had hardened. "Regina, when was the last time I consulted my mother's complete medical dossier?" The question caught his wife by surprise. "You've always been busy with the company, darling. You delegated these matters to me, remember?" "Exactly. I delegated." Edward ran a hand through his grey hair. "I trusted you to look after my mother's well-being while I ensured the continuity of the family business. And I did." Regina stood up, a note of desperation infiltrating her controlled voice. "Your mother needed structure, routine. The doctors confirmed that her condition was degenerative." "Based on what evidence?" Edward interrupted. "On the reports you provided." A telling silence followed. Regina opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Edward turned to his mother. "I want you to be examined by an independent specialist, someone with no connections to our foundation or the hospitals we support." "I don't trust doctors anymore, Edward," Mrs. Cecilia replied. "Not after what I've been through. I understand, but we need to clearly establish your state of health, both for your safety and for legal matters." Regina regained her composure, the brief moment of vulnerability already masked under the veneer of sophistication. "Edward, you are listening to unfounded accusations. This woman," she pointed at Teresa, "is an unqualified cleaner who, for some reason, managed to manipulate your mother against our family." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Our family?" His tone was dangerously calm. "Regina, you seem to forget that my mother is our family." "You know what I mean." Regina tried to regain control. "This employee is sowing discord in our home." "No, Regina." Mrs. Cecilia's voice cut the air like a blade. "It was you who sowed discord when you decided I was worth more unconscious than lucid." A tense silence followed the accusation. Edward seemed to be processing years of neglect and suspicion in a few moments. His expression, normally controlled, now showed traces of suppressed anger. "Teresa, could you leave us for a few minutes?" he asked, without taking his eyes off his wife. Teresa hesitated, looking at Mrs. Cecilia, who nodded discreetly. She left the winter garden and closed the door behind her, but remained in the corridor apprehensive. Raised voices soon began to penetrate the walls, though she could not distinguish specific words. Almost 20 minutes passed before the door opened again. Regina came out first, her face pale but composed, and went upstairs without looking at Teresa. Edward appeared next, gesturing for Teresa to re-enter. Mrs. Cecilia was sitting in the same armchair, but there was a new serenity in her expression, as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Teresa," Edward indicated for her to sit, "I would like to make you a formal offer." "Offer?" "Yes." Edward clasped his hands, adopting the negotiator's posture he certainly used in corporate meetings. "I would like you to leave your cleaning duties and take on the role of my mother's official companion." Teresa blinked, surprised. "But I don't have the training for that." "You have something much more valuable than any diploma," Mrs. Cecilia interjected, extending her hand to hold Teresa's. "You have sensitivity, patience, and above all, a respect. The salary will be 3 times your current one," Edward continued. "You will have your own room in the mansion for the nights you need to stay, and regular time off to care for your son. We will provide private transportation, so you can visit him daily." Teresa felt her head spin with the unexpected proposal. It was a complete change in her life, an opportunity to offer Paul much more than she had ever dreamed of. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Mrs. Cecilia smiled. Not just for me or for you, but for Paul. I imagine how much specialized therapies cost for him." The mention of her son touched Teresa deeply. As Mrs. Cecilia had perceived, Paul's treatment consumed almost all her salary, forcing her to take odd jobs on weekends to supplement her income. "And what about Mrs. Regina?" she asked, concerned about her daughter-in-law's obvious hostility. Edward and Mrs. Cecilia exchanged a meaningful look. "Regina will be less present in domestic matters from now on," Edward replied cautiously. "Let's just say we had a clarifying conversation about family priorities and loyalties." Teresa nodded slowly, understanding between the lines that something significant had changed in the family's power dynamic. "I need to think about Paul, the logistics." "We understand," Edward said. "Take all the time you need. In the meantime, I'll speak to Yvonne to reorganize your duties here." That night, returning home to Brixton after an emotionally exhausting day, Teresa found Paul sitting on the veranda, gently rocking in his favorite chair. The storm had ceased, leaving the air damp and fresh. "Mum home," he announced in his particular way, without looking directly at her. "Yes, son." Teresa sat beside him, exhausted but her mind buzzing with possibilities. "The lady of the house is better?" Paul asked, surprising Teresa. He rarely showed interest in the details of her work. "Yes, Paul, much better." Teresa observed her son with curiosity. "How do you know about her?" Paul continued rocking, his gaze fixed on a distant point. "You talk about her in your sleep. You say she's like me, misunderstood." Unexpected tears welled up in Teresa's eyes. Even in his moments of apparent disconnection, Paul absorbed everything, processing it in his unique way. "Yes, son, in a way, she is like you. Someone special that people don't bother to truly get to know." Paul nodded, satisfied with the confirmation. "You're going to take care of her now." Teresa blinked, surprised. "How do you know that?" "Your scent." Paul finally looked at her for a brief moment. "It's different, decided." Teresa couldn't help but smile. Paul's acute sensory perception always surprised her. Yes, she had made her decision on the way home, analyzing all possibilities, all pros and cons. "Yes, Paul, but don't worry, I'll continue to take care of you too. In fact, maybe we can offer you more therapies, maybe even that special school we visited last year." Paul did not respond verbally, but his hand sought hers on the armrest of the chair, a rare and precious gesture of connection that was worth more than 1,000 words. At that moment, as the London night sky cleared after the storm, Teresa was certain she had made the right decision. Her path and Mrs. Cecilia's had crossed for a greater purpose that both were only beginning to glimpse. The next day she arrived at the Montgomery Alden mansion no longer as a cleaner, but as the matriarch's official companion. Yvonne greeted her with a small approving smile, guiding her to the second floor where Edward awaited her alongside his mother. "Good morning, Teresa." The businessman extended his hand for a formal greeting. "Welcome to your new role." "Thank you for your trust, Mr. Edward." "Just Edward, please." He smiled, a genuine smile that softened his normally austere features. "After all, you're part of the family now." Mrs. Cecilia, seated in her armchair by the now permanently open window, extended her arms to Teresa. "My dear, I can hardly wait to begin this new phase." Her eyes shone with renewed enthusiasm. "I have so many plans. I want to resume my writing, perhaps even start teaching again, and most importantly, I want to meet your Paul." Teresa felt her heart expand with gratitude and hope. Life had taught her to be wary of sudden changes of fortune, but something in that moment, in that unexpected connection with Mrs. Cecilia, seemed predestined, as if the universe was finally balancing the scales after years of struggles and sacrifices. "He will love meeting you," she replied, feeling that she was embarking not just on a new job, but a journey that would transform the lives of everyone involved. What Teresa didn't know yet was that Regina had not accepted her defeat as easily as it seemed. While they chatted animatedly on the second floor, she was in her study on the first floor, on the phone with her lawyer, devising a plan that could shake the foundations of that newly formed alliance. "Yes, I want a complete investigation into this woman. Criminal record, debts, everything. Her voice was cold, calculating. "And I want you to prepare the documents to challenge my mother-in-law's mental capacity. I have evidence of instability that can be very convincing in the right court." The war for control of the Montgomery Alden mansion and the family fortune was just beginning. 3 months had passed since Teresa officially assumed the role of Mrs. Cecilia's companion. The Montgomery Alden mansion, once an oppressive environment of forced silences and closed doors, now seemed to breathe with new life. Windows remained open, allowing the London breeze to circulate through the previously stagnant corridors. Classical music, Mrs. Cecilia's rediscovered passion, echoed through the house's sound system during the afternoons. That Saturday morning, a special event was being prepared in the garden. White tables decorated with orchid arrangements, Mrs. Cecilia's favorite drink being chilled, and a modest but elegant cake with the inscription, "Welcome to the family, Paul." It was Teresa's son's first visit to the mansion. "Everything is perfect, Yvonne." "Thank you." Mrs. Cecilia supervised the preparations with youthful enthusiasm. In recent months she had regained not only her lucidity, but also her vigor and natural authority. She now walked through the house with firm steps, wore discreet makeup, and had resumed the habit of dressing elegantly every day. "Do you really think the young man will like it, Mrs. Cecilia?" Yvonne asked, adjusting the last floral arrangement. The housekeeper, initially resistant to the new dynamic of the house, had become a loyal ally after witnessing her employer's remarkable transformation. "Teresa explained to me that Paul can feel overwhelmed with too many stimuli. That's why I kept everything simple and organized." Mrs. Cecilia checked the table arrangement once more. "The suites are aligned by color, as she suggested, and we have a quiet space prepared in the library should he need a moment of calm." Yvonne smiled, impressed by the attention to detail. "You really prepared yourself?" "Of course." Mrs. Cecilia adjusted a lock of hair that had escaped her elegant bun. "Paul is important to Teresa, which makes him important to me. I want him to feel as welcome here as his mother." The sound of the doorbell announced the guest's arrival. Mrs. Cecilia took a deep breath, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation on her face. She had studied autism, read books and articles to better understand Paul's world. She wanted this first meeting to be meaningful. Edward appeared in the garden, elegantly dressed in smart trousers and a white linen shirt, a more relaxed look than his usual business suits. "They're here, Mother." There was a new tone in his voice when addressing Mrs. Cecilia, a genuine reverence that had replaced the distant formality from before. "Teresa said Paul is a bit nervous, so let's take it slow." Mrs. Cecilia nodded and walked slowly beside her son to the main entrance. There they found Teresa smiling nervously, beside a tall, thin young man with dark eyes that avoided direct contact and hands that moved in rhythmic patterns beside his body. "Mrs. Cecilia, Edward, this is my son, Paul." Teresa made the introductions in a soft voice. "Paul, remember I told you about the lady you helped choose flowers from the catalogue?" The young man nodded, still not looking directly at anyone. White orchids and violets, arranged alternately, harmonious pattern. Mrs. Cecilia smiled, delighted by the precision of his observation. "Exactly as you suggested, Paul. Come see how they turned out in the garden." Instead of trying to shake his hand or force eye contact, Mrs. Cecilia simply began to walk slowly towards the garden, allowing Paul to follow her at his own pace. Teresa exchanged an emotional glance with Edward, grateful for the sensitivity shown. In the garden, Paul stopped before the dessert table, observing the chromatic organization with apparent fascination. "Perfect," he murmured, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips. Lunch proceeded with surprising tranquility. Paul sat between his mother and Mrs. Cecilia, eating methodically and occasionally making comments about the geometry of the dishes or the acoustics of the garden. No one forced conversation, no one demanded typical behaviors. It was an environment of complete acceptance. At one point, Edward, who was observing the interaction with genuine interest, asked, "Paul, your mother mentioned you like mathematics. Is that true?" The young man briefly raised his eyes from his plate. "Numbers are predictable. They follow patterns, they don't lie." "Fascinating." Edward leaned slightly. "You know, our company is developing software that uses mathematical patterns to predict market trends. Perhaps you'd like to see how it works someday." Teresa opened her mouth to explain that it might be too complex, but Paul surprised her. "I would. Can I bring my laptop?" "Of course," Edward smiled, establishing a direct connection with the young man for the first time. "Who knows, you might find patterns that our analysts haven't noticed." After dessert, while Paul explored the library accompanied by Edward, who had discovered in the young man an unexpected source of mathematical insights, Teresa and Mrs. Cecilia remained in the garden, observing the London sky, exceptionally blue that day. "Thank you," Teresa said simply, her words laden with emotion, "for accepting Paul exactly as he is." Mrs. Cecilia covered Teresa's hand with hers, her wrinkled fingers contrasting with the companion's younger skin. "My dear, it was Paul who taught me through you the most valuable lesson of my later life, that truly caring for someone is not controlling them or molding them to our expectations, but rather creating a space where they can flourish by being exactly who they are." A brief silence followed, comfortable and complicit, until it was interrupted by the sound of firm footsteps on the stone path. Regina emerged in the garden, impeccably dressed and made up as always, but there was an evident tension in her posture. "What a touching scene," she commented with false sweetness, approaching the table. "A true family reunion, sirs, with unexpected additions." Mrs. Cecilia straightened in her chair but maintained her composure. "Regina, we weren't expecting you today. I thought you were at the spa in the Cotswolds. I cancelled my reservation." Regina sat down uninvited, placing a leather folder on the table. More urgent matters arose. Teresa felt a tightening in her chest. In recent months, Regina had strategically kept herself absent from the mansion, traveling constantly or staying in the apartment the couple maintained in Mayfair. Her sudden presence, especially on that special day, couldn't be a coincidence. "If you came to cause trouble, Regina, this is not the time," Mrs. Cecilia warned, her voice calm but firm. "Trouble?" Regina raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. "I'm just protecting our family's interests, as I always have." She opened the folder and pulled out a set of documents. "Teresa Santos," her cold gaze fixed on the companion. "Or should I say Teresa Oliver Santos? Curious how you never mentioned your full name." Teresa frowned, confused. "I don't understand." "Of course not." Regina smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just as I don't understand why someone would conceal their family history. Unless they had something to hide." Mrs. Cecilia intervened. "Regina, be clear or leave." "With pleasure." Regina pushed the documents across the table. "Your dear companion, Mrs. Cecilia, is the granddaughter of Anthony Oliver, the former gardener of this very mansion. The man who was dismissed 30 years ago by your husband, accused of theft." Teresa paled. It was a family story she vaguely knew. Her grandfather had worked for a wealthy family until he was unjustly accused of a theft he didn't commit. The event had destroyed his reputation and his health, leading him to a decline that deeply marked the family. But she had never imagined it was the same house, the same family. Is that true?" Mrs. Cecilia turned to Teresa, genuinely surprised. Teresa took a deep breath, trying to organize the thoughts that tumbled in her mind. "My grandfather worked for a wealthy family, yes. He was unjustly accused of theft. It ruined his life." She looked at Mrs. Cecilia with sincerity. "But I swear I didn't know it was this family. The name Montgomery Alden was never mentioned at home. They just called them the employers." Regina let out an incredulous laugh. "What an extraordinary coincidence, isn't it? The thief's granddaughter gets a job in the same house decades later and magically gains the matriarch's trust." "My grandfather wasn't a thief." Teresa's voice rose laden with emotion. "He died insisting on his innocence." "Everyone says that, don't they?" Regina slid another document across the table. "Is it also a mere coincidence that you have a pending debt with the bank that belongs to our family? A loan for your son's medical treatments, that is. Let's see, 3 months overdue?" Teresa felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. It was true. She had taken out a loan to pay for Paul's surgery the previous year. With the loss of her previous job, payments had fallen behind until she got the job at the mansion. I'm regularizing this situation with my new salary." "Naturally." Regina's smile was predatory. After securing your privileged position in this house, Mrs. Cecilia, who had remained silent analyzing the documents, looked up. What is your point, Regina? That Teresa planned some elaborate revenge for her grandfather's dismissal 3 decades ago, or that she is an opportunist trying to get money? Both, possibly, Regina leaned forward, or perhaps something even more calculated, like influencing a vulnerable lady to alter her will. Teresa stood up, trembling. Never. I've never spoken of money or wills with Mrs. Cecilia. I've never asked for anything beyond my salary for my work. Sit down, both of you. Edward's grave voice interrupted the confrontation. He had returned to the garden alone and was observing the scene with a serious expression. I've heard enough. Regina smiled, confident. Edward, darling, finally. I was just explaining how this woman manipulated your... Enough, Regina. Edward's tone was cutting as steel. Paul is in the library and can hear. I will not allow that exceptional young man to be exposed to this kind of hostility. Regina recoiled, momentarily disarmed by her husband's unexpected concern for Teresa's son. Edward approached the table, quickly examining the documents Regina had brought. Teresa, did you know this was the family your grandfather worked for? No, sir. I swear on everything sacred. Edward nodded, seeming to accept the answer. And this debt with the bank? Teresa lowered her eyes, ashamed. It's true. Paul needed surgery last year. The health plan didn't cover everything. I did what any mother would do. I understand. Edward collected the documents carefully and turned to his wife. Regina, you have invested considerable time, resources, and energy to unearth this information. Just protecting our family, she repeated, confident. No. Edward slowly shook his head. You are desperately trying to regain the control you lost. Over this house, over my mother, over me. Regina paled slightly. Don't be ridiculous. This woman, Edward interrupted, has done more for my mother in 6 months than you have in 10 years of marriage. His voice was low, but carried an unwavering conviction. And you know what else, Regina? She has done more for my personal growth, too. An astonished silence followed. Regina seemed unable to process what she heard. Your personal growth? She finally repeated, incredulous. Yes. Edward looked beyond the garden to the city stretching to the horizon. I spent decades building fortunes, acquiring power, expanding influence, and in the process I forgot what my father always said. At the end of life, Edward, no one regrets not having worked more. They regret not having loved more. He turned to Teresa with a genuine smile. Your son is extraordinary, Teresa. In just an hour of conversation, he showed me a mathematical perspective that could revolutionize a project we've invested millions in. But more importantly than that, his voice choked slightly. He reminded me what it's like to see the world with genuine curiosity, without cynicism. Teresa felt tears in her eyes, maternal pride flooding her chest. Thank you. Edward turned to Regina, his expression hardening again. As for you, you are dismissed. Regina's eyes widened. Dismissed? This is my home. No, it's not. Edward sighed deeply. As you well know, this house belongs to my mother. And your behavior in recent years. He looked meaningfully at Mrs. Cecilia, raises serious legal questions about elder abuse that my lawyers are eager to explore. Regina stood up abruptly, the veneer of sophistication finally cracking to reveal panic. You can't do this. We have a prenuptial agreement which provides for dissolution due to improper conduct, yes. Edward remained imperturbable. Would you like to discuss your definition of improper conduct in public court, Regina? With all the altered medical records, staff testimonies, and security camera recordings that you didn't know I had installed 3 months ago. Regina's face lost all color. Without another word, she collected her folder and walked stiffly out of the garden, her impeccable posture finally defeated by the weight of her own manipulations. When she disappeared, Mrs. Cecilia let out a long sigh. I'm so sorry about this, Teresa, and I'm even more sorry about what happened to your grandfather. She took the companion's hands in hers. I'd like to know more about him, if you don't mind. I have a vague memory of a gentle gardener who grew extraordinary orchids. Teresa smiled through tears. He loved orchids. Until his last day. Edward cleared his throat, visibly moved. Teresa, about that debt. I will pay it, Mr. Edward. With my current salary, I can normalize the payments in... "The debt no longer exists," he interrupted softly. "Consider it a small gesture of reparation for what my family did to your grandfather. And please, it's just Edward. I think after everything we deserve that informality, don't we?" Before Teresa could respond, Paul appeared in the garden, walking at his peculiar pace. "Ma'am, I found books on set theory in the library. Can I borrow them?" "Of course you can, Paul." It was Mrs. Cecilia who responded, to everyone's surprise. "In fact, they are yours. A welcome gift to the family." Paul looked briefly at the elderly woman, a rare moment of eye contact. "Family?" "Yes, dear." Mrs. Cecilia smiled gently. "Family isn't just about who shares our blood, but who shares our path, our sorrows, our joys." Paul processed the information for a few moments, in his unique way, like different mathematical patterns that complement each other to form a harmonious system. Mrs. Cecilia laughed, delighted by the analogy. "Exactly, Paul, exactly." That late afternoon, as the sun slowly set over London's skyscrapers, four unlikely people shared a moment of genuine connection in the garden of the Montgomery Alden mansion. Edward, the businessman rediscovering his humanity. Mrs. Cecilia, the matriarch, regaining her voice. Paul, the young man who saw the world through unique patterns. And Teresa, the woman who, through the simple act of seeing others as they truly are, had transformed not just a house, but entire lives. As she watched her son chatting animatedly with Edward about mathematical theorems, Teresa remembered the words she had said to Paul months ago. On the small veranda of their home in Brixton, "Everyone deserves to be truly seen, beyond appearances." Mrs. Cecilia, as if reading her thoughts, gently squeezed her hand. "You know, Teresa, I spent my life being defined by others, daughter of, wife of, mother of. You were the first person in decades who saw me simply as Cecilia. And you saw me as more than just a cleaner," Teresa replied, emotional. "No, dear." The elderly woman smiled wisely. "I saw you as an extraordinary cleaner, someone who cleans not just dust but also hurts, prejudices, barriers, someone who sees value where others see only function." A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient trees in the garden, carrying the scent of the orchids Paul had helped select. In that moment of perfect harmony, Teresa understood that true care, the kind that liberates, instead of imprisons, that strengthens instead of weakens, was perhaps the deepest form of love one human being could offer another. And that love, silent and persistent, had finally triumphed where pride, greed, and appearances had failed. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope Teresa and Mrs. Cecilia's story has touched your hearts, showing how genuine care can transform lives. To experience more emotions like this, we have a special playlist with other British stories that explore the strength of human bonds beyond blood. Find it by clicking here. If this narrative resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and share your feelings in the comments. Every day we bring new stories that celebrate the richness of the human experience in all its complexity. Until our next meeting,